tonight is going to be a wonderful night. My friend Henry Rowan from the Pennsylvania Center for Photography that Ginny, I, and a few others have been involved in is our judge for the images that won through honorable mention over 2021. We'll go through each of the 4 groupings, and with each group, we'll announce Henry's choice as the winner of that group. And after we've gone through that, Henry will take over and do a selected critique as a learning experience. And I think that's going to be a really fabulous night for us to hear what Henry is going to be telling us. And with that, we'll get started, and I will share my screen. If you can all mute your mics, we'll have open mic when Henry is talking. Any issues, I guess you can just speak up. So I'm going to share a screen now, and you'll see my Lightroom. Can you all see that? Jenny, can are you seeing my screen?
Yes, I am. I can see your screen. I see I see fall in New Hampshire.
Okay, so we're starting with Class B Nature. And you'll see the artist's name with the title in the upper left. And I'll try to run through these with around equal time. Maybe. That's interesting.
Vince, I'm just seeing you.
You're just seeing me.
Yes. Let me see.
Are others seeing the screen?
I see the trees in the sky.
Yeah. So I would have to say it's probably on your end, Henry. I don't know. Do you have something disabled?
I don't know. I'm going to see. It says I am viewing the Berks photographic screen. And
You should be.
okay, got it.
Got it?
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. So Reaching Up by Charlie Bevins. Blossom by Gab Allen. Let's see. Sorry about that. My mouse ended up controlling this. Oh my goodness. Hold up. Pollen Collector by Jackie Henney. Waterhole by Deb Pat. Home with Lunch by Karen Lay. Morning Rain by Mia Curran. Geyser by Gab Allen. Fallen by Gab Allen. Bud in the Wind by Bob Gross. Proud Mother by Bob Gross. Glad Bloom by Mia Curran. Reflections by John Conlon. Runaway by Bob Gross. And I think that is it. technical issues. Green on Black by Bob Gross. Spring Sun by Bob Gross. Caught in the Rain by Mia Curran. Wildflowers by Mia Curran. Fall Colors by Karen Lay. Octorara Heron by Bob Gross. Puff by Bob Gross. And now I do think we're at the end. Yes. So now I'll show you the selection by Henry. This is honorable mention, Puff by Bob Gross. Third place, Waterhole by Deb Pat. Second place, Green on Black by Bob Gross. First place, Octorara Heron by Bob Gross. And we'll go to Class A Nature. We're going to save the critiques to the end. So Class A Nature, Cup of Snow by Joanne Stam. Swiss Beauty by Lauren Kingsley. Jordan Pond by Bill Coughlin. Bee on Butterball Bush, Ginny Lodge. Low Drops the Burning Sun by Ginny Lodge. Pollen Galore, Ivan Bubb. Foggy Went A-Courtin', Tom Story. Away We Go, Ivan Bubb. Mr. Blue, Joanne Stam. Pools of Water, Ivan Bubb. Follow the Stream, Ginny Lodge. Begging, Ginny Lodge. Progressive Bloom, Tom Story. Hickory Run Falls, Rick Shea. Please, I'm Praying, Ginny Lodge. A Walk in the Park, Lee Reeves. Raymond Skill Falls, Rick Shea. And I think there are a few others. Korong Dawn by Lee Reeves. Living on the Edge by Vince Pellegrini. Coming Home, Vince Pellegrini. And When Fall Comes to New England by Rick Shea. So the choices by Henry for honorable mention under Class A Nature, Living on the Edge by Vince Pellegrini. Third place, Coming Home, Vince Pellegrini. Second place, When Fall Comes to New England, Rick Shea. And Class A Nature, first place, Karong Dawn by Lee Reeves. If you were fast enough, you saw the little stars. I'm sorry about that. And that's because I didn't do that. So we'll now do Class B Pictorial. Psychedelic Sprinkles by Kathy Grimm. This is Class B Pictorial. Reflection Pass by Rob Cordes. Insignificant by Deb Pat. Haunted Bridge to Nowhere, Brian Hare. Stonehenge Sunset by Rob Cordes. A Crater by Debbie Pat. Gorangoro Crater or something similar. Sorry about that, Deb. Framed by Charlie Bevins. Balto by Rob Cordes. Caboose Man, Barbara Kaufman. Looking Down, Charlie Bevins. Zigzag by Gabrielle Allen. Not by Kathy Grimm. Old Time Train by Tom Russo. Supplies, Gabrielle Allen. Fire and Ice, Bob Gross. To Stir with Glove, Bob Gross. Moonshot, Bob Gross. Morning Glow, Bob Gross. R&R, Bob Gross. Hunter, Mia Curran. No Horses Here, Bob Gross. Tiger in the Jungle, Mia Curran. Leaves, Karen Lay. 2020, Bob Gross. Honey, I'm Home, Bob Gross. And I think that's it. So for Class B Pictorial, honorable mention, Psychedelic Sprinkles by Kathy Grimm. Third place, To Sir with Glove by Bob Gross. Second place, Fire and Ice by Bob Gross. And first place for Class B Pictorial, 2020 by Bob Gross. We have one more group, Class A Pictorial. Holiday Smile by Tom Story. Where Did Everyone Go by Mark Searfoss. Coptic Priest by Lee Reeves. The Pagoda by Ivan Bubb. Unperturbed by Ginny Lodge. Ready and Waiting by Tom Story. Misty by Mark Searfoss. Should Have Seen Me When by Vince Pellegrini. Guarding the Colorado by Vince Pellegrini. Tight, Tom Story. Daylilies by Jenny Lodge. Window Garden by Tom Story. Coming and Going by Vince Pellegrini. Much to Ponder by Vince Pellegrini. Pontiac Indian Chief by Rick Shea. Playing with Emotion by Bill Coughlin. Byron Bay Lighthouse by Ivan Bubb. Water Drop Magic by Larry Stamm. Division of Wealth by Ivan Bubb. Magnolia Bud by Rick Shea. Martha by Lauren Kingsley. In a Glass Darkly by Lee Reeves. Winter into Spring by Rick Shea. Sapsucker by Jenny Lodge. And I believe that that's all of them. And picked by Henry as honorable mention, Class A Pictorial, Byron Bay Lighthouse by Ivan Bubb. For third place, Unperturbed by Jenny Lodge. Second place, Division of Wealth, Ivan Bubb. And first place in Class A Pictorial, Coming and Going by Vince Pellegrini. So again, that was, I'm going to stop screen sharing. That was the images. They were the images that had been placed by the judges through this year. And Henry, thank you for your selection process. Henry was blinded totally to the makers of the images. And all he had was the image title and the class and the category.
Nonetheless, I'm expecting a healthy check from Bob Gross.
So with that, Henry, I'll let you take it away. And if you want to select images for your critique. And Henry asked that we just have open mic unless you have noise in your background, and to have this as an open chat as he's discussing. So if you can screen share, Henry, that would be great.
I will, in just a second. I'd like to say a couple of things first off. This year has been interesting for a number of reasons. If we forget everything else that's going on in the world, I've always held the view that judging is really very erratic. And I'm convinced more so of that right now, which is one of the reasons I've suggested doing it in this format. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a number of images, probably 12 to 15, depending on time, and talk about them and some of the technical aspects of why I made certain decisions, things that I might suggest. However, since we won't be covering all the images, if you would like comments on a specific image, I'm happy to do that as part of this. So when we're finished, I'm more than happy to stay as long as you want, and I will explain, tell me what image you have, and I'm happy to talk about it. But like I said, a couple things happened that have convinced me that you should not really listen to judges very much. And the reason for that is twofold. Earlier in the spring, I entered a competition, and I have been successful in entering this competition for the past 10 or 12 years. And I entered what I thought was my best stuff that I've ever done. And I got blown out, was not accepted into it. In fact, I've judged this competition in the past. And that rather irritated me. And then I found out that the entire judging process by one person of over 900 images lasted just slightly over 2 hours, which really did irritate me. So I don't think, and the images that I submitted were very, very successful. They've been sold internationally at this point. And what I've come to accept is that judging is just sort of a crapshoot. He didn't like my stuff. Turns out that I don't like most of his stuff. So don't take the judging with too much of a more than 1 or 2 grains of salt. The other thing that happened is our last competition for the Pennsylvania Center for Photography was our Transformations exhibition. And what we did was we narrowed down to about 225, 250 images. And then we put it out to the actual photographers who entered the show. And there was zero consensus on what made the winning image. In fact, the first part, we asked people to say we broke it into 3 groups, and we wanted you to select 5 images from each group without naming them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just 5 images that you liked. Zero consensus, less than 25%. The top vote getter got less than 25% of the votes from his fellow photographers or her fellow photographers. I don't remember which it was. Then we took the top 20 or 25 images, I'm not sure which it was, and we had people vote on them. And once again, the winning image got 27.5% of the vote. So basically 1 in 4 people voted for the top image, and that was it. There was so little consistency across the board that it's led me to believe that, it's very, very personal. And the judging really doesn't matter in terms of the feedback you're getting. It matters whether you're getting into the shows or not. But from the point of view of, does it matter to me what the judge thinks? The answer is probably not. So what I would urge you to do is to shoot for yourself. Don't worry about the judge. Don't worry about the camera club. Don't worry about the competition, but shoot for yourself. And that's what I think is really wrong with a lot of the photography today. People aren't shooting really for themselves. They're not telling a story. Traveling Wilburys song says, you may be old and gray, but you still have something to say. Now, those of you that aren't old and gray may take some offense, but I hope you get the point. You have something to say. Your camera is one of your voices to say that. And it can be, your vision can be very unique. It can be very transient. The stuff I'm shooting now is very, very dark. And that's what my mood is. That's what a lot of people's moods are. That's the story that I'm telling right now with my photography, which is way, way off from what it is in normal years. But really just shoot for yourself, ignore pretty much everybody else. If you like it, that's all that matters. And what I'd urge you all to do is to basically stop taking pictures and start creating photographs. Think things through. Try different angles. Rather than just, taking a walk to take pictures, be more specific in your goals. Go out and try to create photographs. Have ideas in your head. And, if you come upon a covered bridge, don't snap a picture of it. Spend an hour, walk around it, enjoy it, really get into it. The same thing with flowers. If I looked up on Google pictures of roses, there's probably 12 billion on Google. That doesn't mean you shouldn't take it, but that means you need to look at a rose differently to get attention. So that's kind of what I'd urge you all to do. And on that note, we'll go over to the screen share and let's see. Is my screen up at this point?
Not yet, Henry. There we go.
There we go. Okay, and right now all I have is Lightroom up on that screen.
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me just move this around.
And you just want spontaneous comments as they come in, Henry, let them speak up?
Yeah, if there's questions as we go through, just ask, and we can have a dialogue on it. And the first one I'm going to pick up is watering hole here. And that's a nice shot. But the question that came up in my mind was the processing of it looks a little bit weak. And I looked into it. One of the nice things about doing it this way is I can actually look and see on many of the images what your settings were, what the camera was, and that sort of stuff, which is very helpful in this. And this was taken on a point and shoot. And what it shows is two things. Number one, that the point and shoot is capable of producing quite nice images. This is a pretty image, and it's well done. But when we now, and the same thing applies to cell phones. You can take good sharp pictures with cell phones. So why shouldn't we all do that? And the answer is, when I look at it, is when you start to try to get detail out of the sky, I'm going to exaggerate it here. Look what happens.
Mm.
So if you're wondering, when you're traveling, oh, why don't I just take my point and shoot with me? That's why you don't. And all I'm trying to do is illustrate some of the differences between camera types at this point. And that's why people carry the equipment that they do. There's nothing wrong with the picture that was taken, but it really limits you. So you go from having a nice shot, but you can't really take it to that great shot level because technically you're limited. So, that's one thing I'd urge you to look at. Let's see. Ducks on a log. Okay. This is a nice shot, but it loses something because the duck that's over here on the right-hand side is soft. And it's really not necessary. It's nice as a panorama, but the duck is soft, it's too close to the edge. So be a little bit more careful with your cropping. You don't need to include everything into the frame. If we just go and we take, I guess, mama duck out, all of a sudden the image is much, much stronger. So when you're doing things like this, there's no problem with shooting the duck on the right, but I've said this before, and I think I've said it at your club, cropping is not a mortal sin in any of the world's major religions. Be willing to crop, shoot a little bit wide. We have a couple of examples of that in tonight. Shoot a little bit wider, give yourself some room. Most of the cameras today have plenty of pixels to handle some cropping. The next one from this group, I think it's in this group. Halos. It's hard to see that there's a halo here, but it's very obvious once you have your eyes kind of trained for it. And again, I can illustrate it quite clearly by just pulling out the halo there. Not only do you have the white outline going through, but you could see the changes in the shades of blue. When you're working with skies like this and you're dropping an eagle onto a blue background, then you have to be super careful. This stuff is always hard to do, but you have to be careful with it. If it was shot this way, and I don't have that information on this, oh, I do. I don't know if the sky was blue or what, but something is causing that halo. So regardless of whether it's natural or was induced in post, which is what I suspect it was, it has to be corrected for it to get up to that next level. You know, with the Conowingo Dam well, you're relatively close to the Conowingo Dam, I would suspect.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, you're going to have lots of really good eagle shots. So when you start to see eagle shots that, you know, have halos around them, now you're comparing them to a lot of shots that don't. And that represents a problem. So be really careful with that. The other thing that you want to do on this particular shot is Lightroom, and most of the programs now have a slider control for shadows, and you can really bring out the detail underneath the bird. And that actually may have corrected some of the okay, so that corrected some of the, not entirely, but some of the haloing problem. So you want to play around. As soon as you start to get into radical processing, you're going to start creating problems for yourself. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it and shouldn't get really extreme about it. You just have to be very careful. And let's see here. Is this fall in New Hampshire? Nope. Fall in New Hampshire is well done. The problem from my perspective is that it is shot from a standing position. So it's the shot that everybody sees, which relegates it into, you know, a nice postcard shot. It's a nice travel shot. But you want to get down and get a different perspective than everybody else is seeing. You know, anybody with the same lens can walk up and take this shot. Okay, so you want to do something different. And that's going to be, you know, getting down lower. It was shot with a wide angle lens. It was shot with a 19mm lens. So it's, even if it's on a crop camera, I don't know which camera it is at this point, but you know, it's basically a wide angle shot. So get down lower, change your perspective. Now, I also happen to know that one of the problems with getting down lower is the fact that you have to get back up. So if you have somebody there to help you or a walking stick, you should do so. Now, the other thing that we see on this, when we look at the histogram up here in the upper right-hand corner, we see a lot of heavy shadow details. If in the old days, Ansel Adams and Fred Archer came up with a thing called the zone system. And the zone system is something that every photographer should learn about, because it helps you understand how your tonality is working. And it basically divides the visual nature of the photograph into 10 zones, ranging from black with no detail to white with no detail. And it's really not until zone 3 and zone 4, which is at the shadow end of things, that you can start seeing detail. And that's what's blocking up over here. So if I go in and I just take my shadow detail, notice what happens immediately. It really brightens up the image. And going back here doesn't, you know, making it more shadowy doesn't really help it. And you lose some of the colors. So these are things that you have to play with to take your images to the next level. And, you know, you can do things like, if we go to a brush over here, over in Lightroom, I very rarely work in Lightroom because I find it annoying. Excuse me. You have all the same controls in Photoshop, plus it creates a layer for you, or you can make it create a layer. So it's much easier to take something like this into Photoshop. But you can work in this area with vibrance and things like that. Up the vibrance, and then, oops. Where's my vibrance? Oh, that's what it was on. Okay. So you can increase the saturation anyway. The brush tools don't allow you to increase vibrance, and work around particular areas so that you can change how the viewer is looking into the frame. And if you had gotten down a little bit lower and played a little bit more, now you have a really nice leading into the picture and nice colors. And in fact, one of the other groups has a picture, and I don't remember what I gave it, but I think it was a second or a first, because of the way it was shot. Not that it was necessarily any more colorful or really any different than this, but the view into the picture was different because of the way it was laid out. This looks like a leading line, really doesn't work that way for it. So now I'm going to go to group 2, and I believe this is what? This is
Class A
nature.
nature.
Yep. Okay, so you guys get picked on more. This is the winning shot, and I wanted to bring this up because you have so much negative space in this that it really works. I mean, I love this shot. The simplicity of the shot is great. What makes this special to me is the inclusion of these out of focus reeds. It totally changes the shot. It focuses your attention onto the bird. And it's very, very nicely done. A wonderful shot. Not every shot has to be super complicated. So just something to keep your eye on. This is Bubble Pond. It's an area I know very well. I've shot this for years and years and years and years. But again, it's kind of the same shot that everybody takes. And one of the things that happens is, again, we've got a wide angle lens on this. What if you shot it with a telephoto? What if you got rid of all this in the beginning, because it's not really doing anything? This area right here, if you can see where I'm pointing, the grasses on the left-hand side aren't sharply in focus. Part of the problem is it was shot at f4. You needed a little bit more than that. But what if you had cropped it in something like this? Now the shot starts to get more interesting. Now, this is not perfect, but this is a great example of one of those shots where what you do is you walk up to the water's edge, you take the picture, you turn around, you go back to the tea house and have a cup of tea or something like that. Jordan Pond, if you haven't been there, has a big old tea house, and the former one that burned down was really nice. But this is a scene that you need to work, because everybody is doing exactly the same thing. They're all walking straight into this particular point, taking the picture and leaving. So what you need to do is you need to look for ways to make your shot different. How can you include these grasses, which are pretty cool and aren't always there? In most of the time they're green, or if they haven't even, a lot of times in the spring, they're not even up yet. How do you do that? Just work the shot, try different focal lengths, get down on the ground and do it. So I really like that one. Our birds on a stick here. This is a good shot, except it suffers from a technical problem that you might not have thought of. This, I believe, was shot on a Canon 100 to 400 millimeter lens, and it was shot at 5.6 with a teleconverter on it. Okay, if you're going to do this, and you certainly can do that, except that it falls into the category of just because you can do something doesn't mean it's a good idea. And the reason that it isn't is the limitations of the equipment. The 100-400 has never been sharp at 400. It's acceptable, but it's not great. And certainly not great at 5.6, which is its widest aperture at 400. Throw a teleconverter onto that, you're going to soften it down. Even though the teleconverter is pretty good, you're softening it down. So you've lost a lot of sharpness here by doing those things. And shooting long is always a challenge. I hate to say this, but there's a reason that a 400 millimeter 2.8 or a 500 millimeter f4 costs $8,000 to $12,000. There's a reason for it. And, you know, obviously that's not in most people's budgets, but when you're shooting something like this with more consumer grade lenses, what you need to do is you need to back off a little bit. Okay, so back off to 350. You'll find that there's a big difference. And you had enough shutter speed. Maybe not. This is at 2,000th of a second, which you need to stop the birds chirping. But I try to get another stop to go to F9 or F11 just to get that extra little bit of sharpness off of this. Very well captured image that suffers from you know, the limitations of the equipment. And that applies to the Canon lenses. Nikon has a 200 to 500, which is crazy sharp at 450 and pretty yucky at 500. All of them, you want to back off at least a little bit. And what I would suggest doing is putting your camera on a tripod, turning off the image stabilization, and then running a series of tests on an image that has something that's very clear and easy to focus on, such as a sign, a clearly printed sign, and see where your lens starts to fall off. Okay. The early 100 to 400s were junk after 300 millimeters. The newer ones start to lose it, maybe 325 to 350. So find out what your lens is doing. And then you can add the teleconverters and work that out, but you should know what your limits are with that.
And would that be a little less sharp if the image stabilizer was on, if it was on the tripod?
Yeah, it is. Because what happens is that most of the image stabilizers on lenses and camera bodies don't react nicely to tripods, so turn them off. That's not quite as true on mirrorless cameras. Doesn't seem to be. In fact, you know, although you can turn it off, I shot some stuff the other night with the Nikon Z6, which is a mirrorless, and I did not turn it off, and it was dead on sharp. So it depends a little bit on the camera. It certainly depends a lot on the lens. But what happens is the image stabilizer is a gyroscope, and what it's doing is it's trying to move in concert with your moving. If the camera is steady, the stabilizer is still moving, trying to find something. So the image softness that you'll see is the stabilizer itself hurting you. So
I'm sure the stabilizer, this is my image actually, and this was a borrowed lens, and I don't usually use this lens. So there was a lack of familiarity with the lens and what it could do. I'm sure the image stabilizer was off, and I did have it on a tripod, but
okay.
I mean, I'm sure I did. Yeah, I'm sure it was on a tripod.
It's a really nice capture. You know, one of the things that's difficult for all of us to do is accept the fact that the equipment has limitations. And the 100 to 400 goes into the category of a pretty good lens. And it goes into the category of a very good lens as long as you bring it back down a little bit from the 400. And that's kind of the problem.
Yeah, I knew it wasn't sharp enough.
Henry, I'm so glad you said that there's limitations with equipment, because I've heard so many pros do their talks and say it's not the equipment, it's the photographer, and nobody can afford their equipment.
Right, that's exactly right. And really, I'm almost done preparing a presentation on how to buy a camera. And what we tend to do is we tend to miss what's really important to us. To find a camera system that covers everything is really, really difficult. But if we start looking at things that are what we need, what we actually need, rather than what the advertisers say, then we can look at buying a camera differently. For example, if I was shooting mostly macro, I used to shoot Canon. I went from Nikon to Canon, and now I'm back to Nikon for some very specific reasons. But I chose my camera system for those reasons. If I was shooting mostly macro, I would buy Canon. Okay? No doubt about it. If I was doing 90% travel photography, I would throw my Nikons in the river and I would buy an Olympus, without a doubt. Okay, I shot a lot with an Olympus during a test period this summer, and it has some flaws, but it also has some real advantages to it. If you're shooting long like this, generally, Nikon and Canon are going to be about the same. It's a toss-up more than anything else. So, you really need to think about what you want to shoot. So,
I have a comment about the teleconverter. I shot IndyCar racing for quite a few years, and I was using some pretty good equipment, like 200 to 400 millimeter Nikkor lens, which was great. And I thought, well, I could use a little more reach, so I put a 1.4 on it. And I discovered, after a number of trials and tests, that the degradation from the 1.4, and it was a really good teleconverter. I could do basically the same thing by cropping, because my camera had enough resolution. Now, yeah, there's a little bit of depth of field situation might occur, very specific and very, very minutely, important. But instead of putting that extra piece of glass in there, with the amount of pixels that we have in resolution, you can crop it, for that amount of time, that amount of space, and get a very similar and much sharper image.
You're absolutely right. I shot professionally with Nikon for years, and I shifted to Canon again on specific things, because what I found is, even though I had top of the line Nikon equipment, we went to a Phillies game, and I had borrowed one of the Canon's first 70 to 300 with image stabilization. And even though I had shot before in the evening, I didn't know that the Phillies had pinstripes on their uniforms until this $300 lens with image stabilization said, oh, what a difference this is. So yeah, you're absolutely right. You have to really think through some of the equipment purchases. I currently have a 70 to 300, sort of a higher end consumer grade Nikon zoom that's really, really good. And that lens at 300 is better than my 70 to 200, which is $2,200 plus the teleconverter for another $4. So that $500 lens is better than a $2,800 set, which is exactly what you're saying. So it's just stuff like that and that's kind of why I wanted to do it this way, talk about some of that stuff. This was the other picture, and I don't remember exactly. I think this was second?
Yes, number 2.
Number 2. This is beautifully done. And it's a very simple shot, but it's very nicely conceived. If you look how this front element is focusing your attention, and you have a tail to it leading you right in, and it leads you right into the center of the picture. And if you remember the shot before, how much of the shadow area was over here on the left-hand side. And look at this one, you have very little. You do have true blacks in there, and you have some shadows in there. But if I could put the two histograms side by side, you'd see an enormous difference. This is much brighter. It's, but more than that, it is this piece. And this simple element is what you're looking for when you're doing landscape photography. The bottom line is that most landscape photography is boring. Hate to tell you that, but it is true. It is just boring. How many arches in Arches National Park can you actually look at before you go, I don't want to see another arch as long as I live? What you need to do is find something that is special about it. And in this case, this centerpiece is quite special. It works really, really well. So let's move on to our frogs. Notice the sharpness in the eyes. Okay. Now this is equivalent to a 600 millimeter lens. It's a 300 millimeter Olympus, and it's maintained its sharpness. If you are going to be doing a lot of wildlife photography and you don't want to carry and can't afford $12,000 lenses that weigh 8 pounds, you really should look at Olympus. And I'd say hold off a little bit because Olympus has been sold. But I think Olympus is a very underrated camera system. And I got, like I said, I had the chance to play with them over the summer. I was very, very impressed. But Olympus is sort of down second tier, maybe even third tier, maybe Fuji. You know, it's Canon and Nikon, and actually Sony is the top seller at this point. But consider what your needs are, and that's why I brought this up. Here we have a very sharp image, and it's the equivalent of a 600 millimeter f4, which you could not buy. Most of us can't afford to buy it anyway, without selling a car or a child. So give it some thought. And here we have, this is really quite a nice picture, but it's one of those that you can do a lot more with. And I'm going to take this into Photoshop. And what ends up being the difference for most people, whoops, where'd my Photoshop go? Oh. The difference between great images and okay images is the detail work. It's very important to spend time on the little details. I'm just going to do a couple things real quick here. So I've got mine set up, my Photoshop set up so that it automatically creates a layer, and then it opens the Adobe Camera Raw. And I'm going to go to the paintbrush section, and I'm going to add some white very quickly right in here. In here. And now I'm going to take a new brush and I'm going to increase the shadow details back in here. Need a little bit more. A little bit right in here. This spot right up here is too white. It's taking my eye away, so we'll knock down the whites a little bit, knock down the highlights. And that stops your eye from focusing all the way in the back. That's a little bit too much. But you can see, new brush, just some really quick, simple tonality changes make a huge difference. And now we're starting to get somewhere. We're going to add back a little white, a little more white in the. Okay, so there's your difference right there. And obviously, yeah, that was probably less than a minute. And if you take your time, you can actually do a good job rather than hacking it like I just did. But there's a big difference between these two images. Not only that, if you were to try to print this image as it is, it would be a nightmare. Okay? When you go to print, you have nowhere near the tonal range that you do on your screen. Especially modern screens, if you get into some of the Retina, 5K Retinas, they've got so many more colors than you can see on a print that you've got to be be careful about that. If you do want to go to print, especially if you're sending it out. One of the things I recommend is find a good local printer. Maybe it's somebody in your club, maybe it's a service that's local, and work with them. Okay, that way you'll get to know what your images are going to look like before you send them out. So we'll just hit OK. But a little bit of extra work, especially controlling the highlights and the shadows, goes a long way. Okay, so I want to find my geese here. Elephants. Okay. Nice picture of elephants. Nothing wrong with it, but it's an image that you see too frequently these days. One of the problems with the world, from our perspective as photographers, is that it's opened up so much that, in the 1980s, you didn't go to South Africa. Nobody went to South Africa, without armed guards. Now, African safaris in South Africa and Botswana are very common. And when something like that happens, when it becomes very common, we see lots of pictures of elephants. I would suggest taking this picture, just so you have a memory. But what happens when you start to look at the elephants as design elements rather than as walking elephants? So let's just crop it. And you can do this anywhere in here. Suddenly it's more interesting to me. Whoops. If I take this and do it any number of different ways, you get different things, different textures. And I would recommend doing them in camera rather than cropping like that. So when you're doing something like this, take your one shot to get the memory or to get what you think you want, and then experiment. Now, walking elephants are among the most dangerous animals in the world. Even though Dumbo was nice, you can get yourself hurt with elephants. So you have to be careful, and they're moving. You don't have a lot of time, but that's what part of being a photographer is, reacting, and reacting quickly. So what that means basically is you need to know your equipment. You grab the shot, and then you start to think really quick, manipulate your camera, look for different angles. Okay. Now, unless I'm totally wrong, this background was added in, which is fine. And even if it wasn't added in, it needs to change. And the reason is that when you look at this image, something immediately hits you as being wrong. And it hit me. I asked my wife to take a look at it, and she sort of looked at it, and I said, "What's wrong with this image?" And she said, "Well, it's nice, and the birds are sharp. I don't understand." She goes, "But something is off." And what's off is you have a sun down here, but the light is coming in on this side of the bird. So immediately that throws you off visually, and that will throw off virtually every judge. Even if there was some other light source up above that was giving you the light here on this side of the bird and on this side of the bird, visually it doesn't work. So the quick, easy answer in this case is crop out the sun. And now you have an image that makes more sense, because this could actually be a reflection. The light could be coming like this. Now it makes a little bit more sense. You also almost always want to give more room in the direction that the animal or the person is moving. Okay, so right now, this seems to be very tight on the right-hand side. And that hurts it a little bit too. But be careful about conflicting light sources. It's something that most people don't think about. And it's something we're seeing more and more of with the advent of Luminar and the new version of Photoshop makes it very easy to change skies. But that doesn't mean that every sky belongs on every image. So be careful, check your light sources, make sure things are going the right way. And let's see, we have one more.
Henry, in reference to replacements, we do allow it under Pictorial, not nature, but only if it's the maker's own background. That's
okay. Yeah, and it may be that this reset, maybe there was something that caused this to happen, but it throws off one's perception of it. There's a theory called the Uncanny Valley, which is often used in robotics and in animation, that describes things that cause a negative visual reaction or a negative reaction in general. And this is one of those that immediately struck me like something's wrong. And it was instantaneous. So even if it was natural, if you're getting that reaction, you probably want to change it. Okay. I don't know exactly which of the many techniques to get this effect. This is an HDR effect without really being super HDR'd. But again, it hits that point where there's a limit to how much dynamic range an image can actually have and be visually appealing. And this, in my opinion, has gone past that. And it looks HDR-ish, almost cartoonish. And you have to be a little bit careful when you're doing that, not to create, this type of effect, in my opinion. And it should never be used on people. I have yet to see an HDR'd photograph of a person, especially in black and white, that doesn't look terrible. So be very careful when you're extending your dynamic range. And you don't necessarily have to do it globally. You can extend your dynamic range in certain portions of it using the either Lightroom or Photoshop, the ACR, any of the programs now will let you do it. You can do it in Nik or wherever. But think in terms of being local in your changes rather than global. So that's what I would recommend there. Okay, so let's go back to the next group. We have one in there, I think. Jets. Good capture. I think the problem is speed rather than focus. And when I looked at it, it was shot at 1/2000th of a second at f7.1, which you really didn't need. And the bigger change, though, is the ISO is at 140. The ISO at 140 tells me you were probably on auto ISO. Auto ISO was invented by the devil, and it is rarely appropriate to use. You should take control of that. This was on a Nikon 750, so you had plenty of space to take your ISO way up. It could have easily gone up another stop to hit 1/4000th of a second. And this is the stuff you need to be thinking of as you're shooting it. Something like this, you need your maximum shutter speed. These jets are fast, especially when they're going right across your vision. Things that are coming at you, you have a lot more time and a lot more thinking that you can do. And you can actually use slower shutter speeds to capture them. When they're going perpendicular to you, it's just really tough. get your shutter speeds up as high as possible. Wouldn't have hurt a thing, to up your ISO. In this case, you only needed to go up to ISO 300 or 400 to get your maximum shutter speed out of that camera. It's also one of the benefits of having higher shutter speeds in cameras. Things like the Nikon D500 have a maximum shutter speed of 1/8,000th of a second. And that's often really important, especially if you're shooting things like airplanes, water, things like that, where you want to really stop the motion. Having that extra stop and shutter speed can be really, really critical. Okay, going down, coming and going. Which one? Is that it? Oh, nope. I'm sorry.
Coming and
Let's
going,
look.
black and white.
Yeah, as long as we're here, this was one of the ones I was going to comment on. The shutter speed selection here is 1/125th of a second, and that was a well-selected shutter speed, whereas the first one with the jets, we needed that super shutter speed to stop them. When you're dealing with a propeller plane, you need a slow shutter speed to capture the propellers. If you shoot a fast shutter speed, they'll just stop in midair. Same thing with helicopters. If you shoot a helicopter at 1/250th of a second, the propellers are going to be stopped in midair, and you're going to think, oh my God, that thing's crashing. So that's one thing nicely done in terms of shutter speed. Very rarely with things like airplanes or car racing, do you want to shoot the back end? Basically, especially with antiques, anything or anybody over 30, you don't want to shoot them from behind. So try there to get them coming at you. That's not always easy. Air shows can be difficult to do, but you want the front of the plane, not the back of the plane. And since you're shooting so slow, you're going to get movement. So you really do need to pan and follow it and go click, 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 and hope you got it. But don't shoot the tails of planes generally. The guitarist over here, number one rule in my book when shooting something like this is don't blow the highlights. If we look up the histogram here, and we could see it in his arm right in here, his neck, there's not any detail left. In a shot like this, you can underexpose it and then bring up the shadow detail without too much problem, but you never want to blow your highlights. And that's what hurt this one a little bit. So underexpose and then figure you can bring stuff back up. And that's a really good way of shooting. The old way, way of thinking was shoot to the right. And you want your histogram to be as far to the right as possible without going over the right edge. That's much less true with good modern cameras. And the reason that they wanted you to do that is because on the early sensors, if you brought your highlights up, you also brought up a ton of noise. And especially with Canon sensors, you also brought up banding. And there was just no way to fix it. So the idea was, well, the shadows are really difficult to deal with. So expose way to the right, as far to the right as you possibly can. That way of thinking certainly no longer applies to Nikon and Sony, which basically uses the same sensors. So my rule of thumb is I never overexpose a highlight. If I do, it's my fault, I did bad. This boat was interesting, but there's a lot more that you can do with this. And again, it's very similar to this image. And we're just going to go and use our brushes. I use Photoshop not only because it's easier and I can create a layer, but the other thing that happens is the brushes in Photoshop in ACR are much easier, much more accurate to use. So here, all I'm doing is I'm going in, I'm changing, adding, increasing the weight. And now I'm going to go back and I'm going to actually use white in this area and pick that up and just real softly change the shadow detail in the boat. It's probably too much. But if we look at it now, you can see very little changes the contrast range of this picture dramatically, but it's not really changing the histogram very much. So look at those little details. Everything, every piece of this image and any image that you do deserves your attention. When you look at Ansel Adams' notes for his various images, you know, they're really complex. He's changing everything. So look at your image, and what I've recommended, and I think I've said before, is once you've created an image and you've post-processed it, let it sit and gurgle in your mind for a day or two, and then come back to it. Because the change from the original is so dramatic the first time you do it, you think you're done. When you come back to it, you say, oh, I need to brighten these whites. I need to change this for a little bit more detail in here. So it's the second and third and fourth iteration of images where you start to focus on the details that really make the difference between having a good image and a great image.
And we have a quick question for you.
Sure.
When you're making these selective changes using camera raw, are you doing those on the background layer? Or are you creating an additional layer every time you make that?
I am making an additional layer every time I do it. Now, I often, because I actually flatten my images on a somewhat regular basis. I also save my images in various forms. So it's not uncommon for me to have, 10 or 12 versions of an image. And what that does is when I screw up, it lets me go back. And I find that easier than having 52 images that are eating up memory. But what I'm doing, get rid of that, is the way what I've done is I've assigned it to a function key. So in my case, it's F3, and that's running a macro. They're easy to do. It's just how do you run a macro in Photoshop will pop you up the directions online. But it first creates the image, and then it loads ACR from the filters menu. And what I just did there was I used the brush. I should have saved it, but and I'll show you why I'm doing it. Let's go totally ridiculous on that. And I'm going to say, okay. Now I'm going to go, that really isn't what I want. That's too bright. So now I can go and change the opacity of that layer down to where I want it. So when I'm making corrections like this, I will actually often overcorrect. And then once I can see it full screen and take a better, longer look, I'll change the opacity to get that correction back to where it should be. Does that answer it, Rick?
Yeah, it does. I generally lean towards Lightroom to make those changes, only because I guess I was not aware that you could actually create those additional layers every time you went in and made those selective changes using the brush.
Yeah, and you can do it manually as well. I mean, in Photoshop, it's Command J on a Mac.
It's Control J on a PC to copy the layer.
Yeah. Now you do have to be a little bit careful when you're doing this, because what will happen is now I've created a copy of the camera raw file, of the camera raw layer. I've not created really a background layer. So if you're doing things like text and you're adding text and making a poster or something like that, you can find that you screwed yourself up pretty badly and have multiple layers sitting on top of each other. But for basic adjustments, this works really well.
And just as a point of clarification, this is Vince, are you making a new layer with every brush adjustment?
No,
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 okay.
no.
I didn't think so, but just to make sure that that was understood.
No, what I'm doing though is I'm using a new brush. So let's just go back. So I'm just going to go in and brighten this up over here. And at the same time on this one, I'm going to darken it down. So what I've done is I've controlled my contrast for this part with my white and my black brushes rather than the contrast control. And that gives you a lot more room to play with. You might say, yeah, that works okay. Now you can add some shadow detail in there. And you can see how dramatic the difference is. And that's obviously too much. But now if I was going to work on the boat, I would not continue with that. I'd create a new brush and do something to it.
But
So
that new brush is on the same layer, is it
that
not?
it is. And if I think that if I have a question or something like that, if I said, do I want to do that? I don't know. I'll consider my options. A lot of times I'll just quit now. I've created my layer and I'll go right back in and do another layer and say work on the rock over here and put them on different layers. It's easier that way sometimes if you're working with a really complicated image to isolate these layers and get to a point where you think you're right. So in general, especially if I'm working in black and white, it's not uncommon for me to have 6 or 7 or 8 adjustment layers over there. Because I'm working in detail. And you don't want to spend, 5 or 10 minutes doing some global changes and find that you've screwed everything up with a small little local change. So that's just the way I work. But this is,
Henry, you have a macro set up, but if you were doing this manually, when you make that those selective changes, can you save to a layer? There's no button within Camera Raw to enable you to do that, correct?
no, there isn't. But you create the layer first. So let's go back to open it, and without the macro, I'm going to hit Command J. I've created a layer. I go up to my filter at the top, and I go down to Camera Raw Filter. And now I'm right back to where I was. The reason I created it as a macro is I use it so often that I simply, I'd rather press F3 because I don't even have to think about that anymore because I do it so much, than do a Command J and then go up to the filter menu. It's just purely a time savings.
I got you. Thanks.
So, and Camera Raw is alone, and the ability to use it as a layer is alone is reason enough to have a Photoshop or a Adobe subscription to Photoshop. It is singularly the most valuable tool in Photoshop. Okay. Now, if you're doing graphic design, people would argue with that. But if you're doing basic photography editing, people have gotten too used to things like Luminaire and Topaz and Nik, and they're missing the basics. Okay, imagine yourself in a dark room, and this is all just dodging and burning and manipulating select colors and things like that. this is the most valuable tool that you have in post-processing, unless you're going to get really wacky about it. And even if you're going to get wacky about it, you should only get wacky, for example, Topaz Impression, which is a paint program. You should not be playing with impression until you have a good image. Okay. Impressions is not a program to use to save a bad image. It is a program to use to create a great image from a good image or a great image already, to alter it. But your base has to be really strong. That's what we see so much of, is people decide, oh, well, I'll just put a paint effect on it and then it will be beautiful. No, it doesn't work that way. You have to have a great image to start with, and then you can take it to that next level. But it should be able to stand on its own. This particular image has the potential to be a really nice, in terms of the tonality and everything, a really nice black and white image. And it's a good image now, but it has a lot more potential to it. And that's what we want to realize within our photography. So,
Henry,
yeah.
I have a question. I have Photoshop and I have Lightroom. I do most of my work in Lightroom, especially for global situations. But I'm looking at this. I've never seen this before. It's very informative to me. The right panel looks a lot like, or almost exactly like, Lightroom's adjustments.
Yep.
Except, am I right that you can do this with 10 layers and do different adjustments for each of those layers, and actually specifically attack one area of the image with each one of these? I'm going to call them Lightroom adjustments, because that's what I'm familiar with.
Yep, you're exactly right. It actually appears in 3 ACRs, Adobe Camera Raw, and it appears in 3 places. It appears in Lightroom, it appears in Adobe Camera Raw, which is available as a standalone program, and in Photoshop. The difference, there's 2 differences between Lightroom and Photoshop. The first is that the brushes are much more, I guess, fluid. They're much easier to control in Photoshop than they are in Lightroom. I don't know why. I don't know why they're not identical, but they aren't. And the other one is the ability to use layers. And to me, that's really critical, because a lot of times I will make an adjustment and I'll say, yeah, that's really too much. You went over the top there, boy. And in Photoshop, I could just tone it down. I just hit my layer and change the opacity, and that reduces the effect. So that's why I use it. The only thing that I use Lightroom for is image management. And I basically hate it, but it's still the best game in town. There are just so many annoying things about the way the Lightroom catalogs work that, like I said, it's the only game, it's still the best game in town, but I don't like it. And if I'm doing vertical or horizontal corrections, it's easier to do it in Lightroom than it is to do it in Photoshop. Again, you have basically the same controls, but for whatever reason, it's easier and more accurate to do it in Lightroom. So,
Henry, does it? I don't really use Adobe Camera Raw that often. Does it have a radial filter like the one in Lightroom?
yep.
Okay.
Yep. And, I actually, and it has the radials and the gradients and all sorts of different things. I don't use them that much. I'm finding, especially this year, I'm doing much more traditional work. I'm going much more toward black and white, and I'm using it almost as dodging and burning tools to an extent, and very specific contrast controls. The new version has a bunch of new stuff to it. And I looked at it when I loaded it up and said, oh, that's neat, that's neat, that's neat. And I haven't used one of them yet. I haven't used any of the tools. And, you know, maybe it's mood, maybe it's anything. I don't find that I need it. But that's my way of working. And if I was doing commercial photography, it would be different. Okay, so if I was still doing, there is no commercial photography right now, basically. But there I'd probably be using different tools and creating different effects.
So in my experience, when I use, you know, I have a Leica Q and I have, you know, a bunch of pixels. And when I use Photoshop and I do a lot of layers, these files get huge.
Yep.
And resource management has always been a concern of mine because, you know, I don't delete anything. You know, I save everything because someday it might become important to me. When you use the camera raw in your layers, does it build up the same volume of
yes,
pixels as it would just in the straight?
sure does.
Okay, so you can go from 24 megapixel to 400 in no time.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm
Okay.
often in it, especially if I'm doing something like a panorama where I've added, you know, 7 or 8 images together and then want to treat them as a, just, you know, do normal stuff to it. You could be talking about 1 or 2 gigs in size. The other problem, and you raise an interesting point. I currently have 24 gigs in my system, and I don't think anybody can really run Photoshop effectively with modern high-res cameras with less than that. Okay, I'm always up against the top. The number one thing you can do to save memory, if you don't want to flatten your layers, I flatten my layers all the time because I don't feel like sitting there and coming back to them. So what I'll do is I'll take a snapshot at, you know, 10, 12, 15 snapshots each time, which really doesn't hurt the memory system, and I'll flatten my images. So I'm dealing with, you know, 2 or 3 or 400 megabyte files rather than, you know, 2 gigabyte files. The other thing you can do is turn off Lightroom, shut it down. So if you're going to be working on an image for half an hour, you know, just quit Lightroom. Lightroom is a pig. And Adobe has not managed with either Lightroom or Photoshop to do one very basic thing, and that's release memory. So if I'm working on an image, I have my activity monitor going on. I can watch my memory, my available memory disappearing. And if I close that image, it doesn't come back. So, and this is a known problem with Photoshop. Seems a little bit better with the latest release, but not a lot. And if you have Lightroom on, that could be 8 gigs. The other thing that you can do is if you have Google Chrome running on your system, turn it off, quit it. The amount of memory that Google uses is amazing. And you can see that in your startup files, just how much it eats, 4, 5, 6 gigabytes. So all of this stuff, you know, as memory has gotten cheaper, the programmers have gotten lazier, and you figure, yeah, you just add more memory. I don't have to do clean code. And it's getting to be an issue.
I have another question for you then. You know, one of my biggest concerns has always been how to store all this, especially, you know, keeping redundancies. I tried Carbonite for a while and different things, but, you know, right now I have an array with a bunch of duplications. How do you manage your volume of data that you accumulate, especially if you're using Photoshop more than Lightroom, because Lightroom's basically a relational database sort of thing. So what's your strategy for maintaining all of your files and your backups and your protection and all that stuff?
All of my finished images go on OneDrive, and that's backed up. very regularly. The other ones are basically done by year, and I'll use 2 hard drives a year. And at the end of the year, I pull them out and I'm done with them, and I'll put 2 more in and, you know, fill them up. So I have a main image folder, and then I have a backup of that drive.
So
I-
if
I
you're
have-
working and you want to go back a couple years, how do you index that in your memory or whatever to know that this is where this image of, you know, the World Trade Centers, you know, was?
Well, generally what will happen is that's where Lightroom works. They'll just, once they're in the catalog, they just won't be, if I take that drive out, say something from 2014.
Oh, yeah, right, okay.
Okay, my 2014 catalog will have it in there. And my naming structure for each of my shoots is the year dash, you know, it would be for now it'd be 2020-12-11, or right, we haven't gotten to the 11th, the 3rd, and then I would name it like New York City.
Right, okay.
Something like that. So the date to me is much more important than anything else. And, you know, I have hard drive sleds all over here. So I have not gone to a full RAID because they're expensive and they really don't do what I need to do. So I have open sleds, and I just, you know, you can now hot swap drives, and I'll just eject one drive, throw it, you know, slide it out and put the next drive in.
What do you use? I use WD.
Yeah, most of my drives are WDs. I had too many problems with CCATEs. About 5 or 6 years ago, they took a bad turn and went south. Generally, for my backups, I'm using WD Reds. Okay,
All right,
and
enough of that.
Yeah.
People
And-
want to talk more about the picture, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think we need to proceed with your critique.
okay, yeah, we have. Well, actually, that was the last one that I wanted to talk about. Oh no, I dearly loved this shot, but it struck me as being too tight, and there just wasn't enough breathing room to it. So if there is more breathing room to this, and it was cropped this way for the here, I'd suggest expanding it out. If there wasn't, again, overshoot a little bit, give yourself room, because even here, if you were to put a mat on this, you'd start to have visual problems with it. The colors, the design is really, really, really nice. It's just too tight. Give your images room to breathe. And I think that's my last comment. Does anybody want me to comment on a specific photograph? Because I'm happy to do that. Okay, then.
Oh, well, I'll jump in. The inner glass darkly photo, which is the one of St. Paul's Cathedral.
Which group is that?
Class A Pictorial.
I think that's the group you're in right now.
Okay, yep. And
There it is.
this one?
Yes,
Oh,
No.
the priest or this one?
22, yeah.
22.
Yep. I really like this. I think that it's quite well done. Technically, there's nothing wrong with it. I really liked it. A lot of these decisions, you know, just are, I don't know quite how to describe judging. I liked, if you asked me tomorrow, I might choose this one as one or two. So some of it's mood. In terms of this particular one, I think the shooting of it, this is one that I probably would have spent a half an hour shooting, trying to find different angles. The upper part bothers me a little bit, but not too much. I love this section in here, really strong. It weakens down a little bit up here, but it's a great image. And the processing's good on it.
Okay, it's just, that, yeah, I particularly love it, but my son doesn't get it. And I just wondered whether, yeah, just what you thought. Thank you.
No, yeah, tell your son he's wrong.
Henry, I think you started to talk about coming and going on the left side. You mentioned the title. If you could maybe throw a comment on that. It's the black and white bridge. Number 2.
This one.
Yeah.
This is a very nice shot. One of the things that a lot of the pictures don't do is they don't tell a story. You don't get involved in them. And this shot, you do. You know that the lights are cars. There's an ethereal feel to it. I think it's a great image. I didn't play around with this one at all. I don't know if there's any more detail in here. Probably not, given the time of night.
Significant noise down there.
Yeah. Obviously a tripod shot, f11, 70 millimeters. Yeah, no, I think that it's very nice. I like the tonality. With black and whites, my background is, large format black and white. And, if the tonality is off, it just immediately throws me off. And the tonality in this is quite good. I like the way the light goes through the bridge. Yeah.
Okay.
But a lot of it's in the story. You can imagine these people coming to and from work, going home. It's good. It's very good.
All right. Anybody else for Henry? Okay, Henry, thank you so much. I'm going to stop your screen sharing, I think.
Okay. Just one quick thing.
Yeah.
If I could.
Yep.
If anybody wants to get in touch with me, there are some websites. Vince also has my email, which is just henryrowan.pcp@gmail. I should put that one up too. But feel free. The center, we have closed our studio because of the COVID crisis. Hopefully we won't be going back to the same location, but hopefully come end of summer next year, we'll have another place. We're not doing workshops until we can get together with people. We are doing a lot of portfolio reviews and online individual help. So if you're interested, you can either get in touch with me through Vince or at
take a screenshot or a phone picture of it.
Yeah, thought of this very last minute, even though you had offered that up before, Vince, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Henry. I can attest to the quality of the workshops. I've done some. The composition workshop is like one of the best talks I've ever had on the topic.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much. I'll let you guys get back to Camera Club stuff, and I want to wish everybody a happy holiday. Please stay safe and wear a mask.
Thank you, Henry. Good night. Folks,
Thank
don't
you.
leave. I'm going to screen share.
Thank you.
I know it's late, and we'll just do this kind of quickly. There were winners from the members' choices, and I just want to real briefly go over those. This is Class B Nature, honorable mention, but this is by the 14 members that chimed in. Reaching Up by Charlie Bevins got honorable mention. Pollen Collector by Jackie Henney got third place. Fall in New Hampshire by Brian Hare got second place. And Puff by Bob Gross got first place. Class A Nature, this was the honorable mention shot, Coring Dawn. This was the #1 for Henry. Third place was Raymond Skill Falls, Rick Shea. Coming Home, second place by myself. And first place by the members for Class A Nature was Tom Story's Progressive Bloom. Class B Pictorial. For honorable mention, Bob Gross to Stir with Glove. Third place, Framed by Charlie Bevins. Second place, Looking Down by Charlie Bevins. First place, Fire and Ice by Bob Gross. And Class A Pictorial. Pagoda came in fourth. I'm sorry, yeah, honorable mention by Ivan Bub. Window Garden by Tom Story came in third. Coming and Going by myself came in second. And Martha by Lauren Kinsley came in first. And then very briefly, I need to go over this with you all for the Michael Day competition. This will only take a minute. This will be in the newsletter. These are the winners that you've had announced tonight. Jenny will have these in the newsletter for Friday. I'll give those to her. I'm not sure how she's going to handle the images. We'll see. Something I want to show you at the very end here. So that's the listing and the member's choice. Just very quickly. And